Over the last 10 months, I have left many things unsaid. This is an attempt to redeem those lost and forgotten conversations that were never had. I didn't feel that you trusted my judgment enough and/or trusted my love enough to articulate such judgments without my being perceived as a dictator in your life. Writing this letter allows me to reconcile all of those thoughts and judgments into a single document that you are able to read and accept, reject at your own discretion. In this format, it allows both of us to be honest about my thoughts and perceptions. In this way, I am hoping you don't feel confronted, at least in the immediate sense, by any oppressive masculine energy I may or may not exude. I am writing this letter to tell you about something very important to me. This letter may be long-winded and difficult to read through. Please take your time and don't let this stress you out. I will be taking my time to write this letter so that I don't leave any leaves unturned. In doing so, my hope is that there is no necessity to read between the lines. I want to be as direct as I can manage. Criticism without condemnation. How can I be certain that my questions and my statements about what I observe are received as I intend them? I truly cannot, and I don't think anybody can. The problem that we all face is that we are constantly making judgments whether we verbalize them or not. We can indeed make things worse by not verbalizing them, by harboring the feelings associated with such judgments as those feelings play out in subtle ways in our day-to-day behavior. So a man or woman is faced with a dichotomy. How do we keep ourselves from suppressing such judgments without dominating those who behave in a way that is abrasive? I think the only way to do so is to operate on an assumption. This person is capable of changing if they want to. The darkness within.
No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. C.G. Jung.
As the stories of the Bible has so beautifully shown us, the adversary, devil, lives within our hearts. We struggle against the evil within us. It doesn't matter how perfect we set our environment, just as the snake was able to enter the Garden of Eden, so too it enters into us. We look into the mirror and sometimes choose to only see the garden. The problem is that we already know the snake has convinced us to eat the forbidden fruit. Why else would we hide like Adam and Eve did from God? We are all touched by evil, whether it is by choice or by encountering it within innocence, does not matter. We carry it still, and it is this evil within us we dare not see in the mirror. It is this same darkness that we hide from the world. It is also the same darkness that we hide from our loved ones. Keeping the analogy of the mirror in mind, let's return to the idea of criticism. Let's imagine that while going through the experiences of life, all that you see is this mirror. When we see something that we don't like, what is the best way to respond? How do we handle encountering the snake in another man's woman's heart? If it were a literal snake, I know my immediate response is a fight or flight response. That doesn't fix the problem, though, does it? The snake is still there, and who knows, maybe the snake will go on to hatch more snakes. Then you have an even bigger problem than before. This analogy reminds me of when the liberated Hebrews were in the desert and were plagued by snakes. They asked God for help, and God had Moses forge a large snake out of bronze, set it up on a cross on a hill, and would immunize any who would have the faith to look at it. A snake on a cross. Doesn't that sound a bit similar to that of Christ? If we mix the two, what do we get? The image of the snake, representing the evil in a person's heart, mixed with the penultimate image of a man who suffered in the worst way possible by the hands of those closest to him. So, the plague of snakes weren't really just physical snakes. These people were plagued by their unwillingness to look at the suffering and evil in themselves. It makes sense, though, doesn't it? I don't think it's far-fetched for a father or mother to visit the suffering in their own life upon their children. I know I have experienced that in my own life. The question is, what do I do about that? Do I condemn them to never change? Do I deny them the forgiveness that I need to give, even to heal myself? Do I deny that the evil visited upon me is a part of who I am? That it didn't change me? If it's a part of who I am, who will love that part? Who could? At the very least, it has to be me. The inner civil war. We all possess a personality that we treasure beyond anything else. We may not know it, but we act as though our personality is a gift from God that must be protected at all costs. Even before the first stories were told, humans have behaved in this way. I imagine that the songs we sang around the campfire as hunter-gatherers to keep the demons away were full of conflict, resolution, resonance, dissonance, good and evil. Life seems to be a story told in so many different ways through the arts, and yet we don't exactly know what it is. One thing is for certain, there will be suffering. This is what all of the religions have been saying since their inception. This is what the story of Christ, the most perfect person to have lived, is saying. Christ even knew what was coming, and he did it anyway. He never compromised on who he was, even if it meant the worst possible suffering imaginable. Being human seems to come with a level of uncertainty that exists within us. We have two sides of ourselves that seem to be at war with each other. Traditionally, we call these two sides the good and bad side. We tend to hide away what we consider bad about ourselves, especially from ourselves. We have the hardest time looking at that side. And as C.G. Jung so beautifully stated, quote, "But what if I should discover that the least among them all, the poorest of all the beggars, the most impudent of all the offenders, the very fiend adversary himself, that these are within me, and that I myself stand in need of the alms of my own kindness, that I myself am the enemy who must be loved? What then? Then, as a rule, the whole truth of Christianity is reversed. There is no more talk of love and long-suffering. We say to the brother within us, Raka, and condemn and rage against ourselves. We hide him from the world. We deny ever having met this least among the lowly in ourselves, and had it been God himself who drew near to us in this despicable form, we should have denied him 1,000 times before a single cock had crowed." End quote. I don't trust you because I know there's a capacity within you for evil. Just as I have the capacity for evil, so too do you. The difference that I see is that you're willfully blind of yours. Since you're willfully blind of your own capacity for evil, I don't trust that dark aspect within you because it is very much real and very much there. I know this because I cannot have a deep conversation with you before you check out. I also know this because I see your coping mechanisms come out, especially when you're stressed. Wanting those you love to succeed. The most cruel aspect of what it means to be human, to me, is that we find ourselves at odds with what we want as individuals and what is good for those that we love. We are forced to make a decision to give where we would much rather keep. I see this in the stories of witches, sorceresses, and goddesses the most because they are what threaten me the most. That isn't to discount that the negative masculine is within me, as I worry about that as well. What do we do when those that we love challenge us in ways that force us to reinvent how we define ourselves? How do I balance myself between my own flourishment and the flourishing of those around me? This mindset is why I instantiated a rule to repeat back to the speaker what was heard, so that the delivering party was satisfied then to make statements that reinforce what the delivering party was saying. In conversation, it is very difficult to want the other person to succeed. We all fear being wrong or looking the fool. So what do we gain by doing this? This method is a great trust-building exercise, and it tells the other person that you genuinely want them to succeed in what they are trying to say, even at the cost of diminishing a position of power. This doesn't work when both parties aren't playing by the same rules. Let's abstract this to something beyond the verbal. How do we know that we are being good parents? There's certainly a point at which I have to decide between succeeding as an individual versus the success of my child. Being a good parent to me is being able to recognize when my own self-interest is getting in the way of my child becoming more of an independent individual. If I am constantly handling problems for my child and not letting them suffer for the consequences of their actions, then I am succeeding as a parent, but they are failing as a child. Failure is to be expected in levels. An infant should be treated as such. A toddler should be treated as such. A child, a teenager, a young man and a man should be treated as such. When we treat them differently, we are either diminishing or coddling their individuality and thus hindering or stunting their growth. Let's abstract even further into the community or the general public. Well, there's sometimes a tendency to think that we know better than the general public does. I'm smarter than they are, and they are stupid for even thinking that way or behaving that way. Even when people behave in a way that bothers us, they have a very good reason in their mind for why they are saying or doing what they did. Yes, I could isolate myself into my own perfect Garden of Eden and pretend that none of that exists here. The snakes still get in. If I am unwilling to recognize the part in myself that can do the things I don't like, then how would I treat myself if I ever ended up doing just as they did? How much would I hate myself? It's too easy and far too lazy to hate people. They are a reflection, and it is that darkly reflection that scares us the most. Instead of wondering why they would do what they did and asking myself what situation I'd need to be in to make decisions like that, I'll get mad, dismissive, frustrated, or annoyed. All of these are just the children of fear. That fear is looking in that mirror and realizing that the darkly or bright aspects of other people exist within myself. Otherwise, I'd never be able to recognize it. This is the recognition that the snake within the other person is of the same make and model as the one that lives in my own heart that I struggle with every day. Chaos and order. The beautiful part of all of this is that these aspects of ourselves that are dark or light have a special quality to them. I am thinking of my favorite quotes. The cracks are where the light gets in. There's a chaotic nature to being a human that can be terrible at first, but becomes something absolutely beautiful once it's fully realized. Like a man that is fully aware of his own capacity for violence and is fully capable of that violence, but he isn't violent. You can feel it in his aura that he would kill you in that instant, but he doesn't and wouldn't. Like a woman that has every capacity to unleash her emotions in righteous fury upon those that would behave as tyrants to the weak, but doesn't because she knows there are very few with that kind of power nearby. There are more important things to do on the day-to-day. The truth, as I see it, is that there's an unpredictable part of ourselves that we hide from ourselves. It's like we made a deal before we came here that we wanted to hide something of value in a very special place it wouldn't be found. We were clever enough to hide it in a place where we would only know where to look. Where is that? It's in the last place we, as individuals, would want to look. It's staring into the abyss, the darkness within ourselves. There's a dragon guarding the gold down there. The hope here is to instantiate a process of transformation referred to as enantiodromia, or conversion into the opposite. What is found is, what was considered evil has turned to good, and what had seemed good has kept alive the forces of evil. Limitations, boundaries, and principles. It is so often these days that we are told the fantastical story as children, and even on into young adulthood by our teachers and mentors, that we are limitless and boundless, that we will forever and always be boundless potential that cannot be left to those outside of yourself to bridle or hinder. All of these kind words are said under the guise of being compassionate. Yes, it is compassionate to tell this to infants, toddlers, children, and young adults because they have not lived nearly long enough to really understand their limitations and boundaries. Who are we to place them upon them? We can start with parents that care about their children's development. Again, we arrive at that fine balance between placing boundaries for children and questioning whether or not we are doing so out of our own self-interest or not. Children need parents, and it doesn't matter, at least early on, whether we are acting completely out of self-interest or not. We need boundaries, and we need limitations. It is only through accepting those limitations and boundaries that we can find what principles we live by. Really, it's the principles that are at the very bottom of all of this. The modus operandi, main objective, or MO, shapes the way in which we approach, interact, and react to the world. And there have been plenty of books that speak on this topic, and they are wonderful classics if you're interested. The most famous of them all is Lord of the Flies, about children marooned on an island that have to construct their own society. Briefly, it's a novel about how children would go about establishing the rules of living if they had no parents. We could extend this to what Friedrich Nietzsche most famously said, "If God is dead, everything is permitted." How do we behave if we don't believe anybody is watching? Do we really need a figure of God in our lives? One thing I have learned is, if you don't find something to worship will find you. Another way to say this in a more base way: if you don't find a father figure will find you. Or, if Daddy isn't around, she'll find one. The latter of these statements is not pretty at all. We need that observing entity to build our principles on so that our limitations and boundaries don't shift. If they are shifty, what does that say about what they are built on? In the words of the old alchemists, as above, so below. Letting go. I think I understand how you might be feeling, overwhelmed by information accompanied by far too many quotes and analogies. Children, families, communities, society, and God. What exactly am I getting at? What am I hoping to achieve here? Am I just wasting my time writing this? The point of life is to find a point. What in my life brings me a sense of meaning that makes all of the suffering worth it? Writing this down allows me to feel like whatever is inside is no longer confined there. It gives me a sense of peace, being able to write down what I have learned and what I believe. It gives me comfort to know that, over the course of the last several months, I have experienced something worthwhile. I can't help but feel like what I've gained is an appreciation and respect for myself that I didn't have before. I have found that I had lost this very aspect of myself that writes something or says something that means a lot to me. The ability to think and speak freely is not something I will give away willingly again. Writing this letter, as stated above, is about saying what I have to say, taking my time to say it, and being okay if I'm the only one that reads it. I have to do this because I'm not going to let myself be diminished any longer. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life with someone that doesn't value this part of me. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life with someone that feels threatened by this part of me. I want to spend my life with someone that encourages me to be courageous, someone that encourages me to wrestle with God. In this instance, I must do what I believe was difficult for you to do, and I was wishing for you to do. Let go. Accept that. Maybe you won't change for me, and maybe I shouldn't expect that from you. How can I expect you to value what has been stated above? How can I expect you to have the same boundaries, limitations, or principles as I do? It's a fool's errand to do so. All I can do is take into account the differences. Can this schism be brought to the divine altar of God in holy matrimony in hopes for successful syzygy? It'd take a miracle of godly proportions.